Dust rose in cloud, swallowing the pale moonlight as the trail wound like a wounded snake through the dry mesquite trees. Each hoofbeat on the dry ground sounded a hollow rhythm, more haunting than the tolling of church bells. I had ridden all night, the heat of my mother's fever burning my spine. The old horse beneath us stumbled, but I held on, one hand clutching the reins, the other wrapped around the lean, hot body that leaned against me. Death lurked, and every mile was a grim struggle with a cruel fate. The first light of dawn was just breaking, painting the horizon a pale yellow. When we reached the McCrae farm, the house stood alone on a knoll, smoke curling from its chimney, a small sign of life in the wilderness. I jumped off the horse, legs shaking, and practically carried my mother into the porch. I knocked once, then harder. Each knock a silent prayer. The door opened slowly, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man. His silhouette was long, bathed in the soft lantern light from within. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing calloused arms, scarred by a lifetime of hard work. His eyes, cold, gray, and unwavering, rested on me. "Please," I gasped, my voice breaking. "I'll do anything. I just need the medicine." "My mother? She's dying." Albert McCrae stood still, assessing me. I was dusty and desperate, my face pale and my eyes red from lack of sleep and worry. My mother moaned softly, a hoarse sound escaping her throat, her skin hot with fever. "I don't trade people for medicine," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "In this house, no one is anyone else's property." My knees buckled. I collapsed onto the porch, still holding my mother. "They said you could help," I whispered. "I saw a boy survive because of your hand. I have no money. No one else will look at Albert McCrae's jaw clenched. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the house. The door closed behind him, leaving me in the pre-dawn cold. The only sound, the uneven breathing of my mother. A few seconds later, the door opened again. There he stood, holding a wooden box filled with glass bottles, rolls of linen, and a small bundle of herbs tied with string. He looked down at us and sighed. "Bring her in," he said. "She can't heal on the cold ground. You two get in quickly." My limbs trembled as I helped my mother. McCrae stepped in, taking most of the weight. He moved carefully, neither hurried nor cool. Inside the simple wooden house, it was warm and clean, smelling faintly of dried sage and wood smoke. He led us into a small room off the kitchen, where a narrow bed had been made up under an old but clean blanket. We gently set Mom down, and McCrae gestured toward a basin. Water was boiling in a kettle on the stove. I moved instinctively, my hands finding work while my heart pounded. My mother moaned softly, her eyes blinking. McCrae knelt beside the bed, took her pulse, then opened a bottle. He poured a spoonful of the black liquid and carefully passed it over my mother's chapped lip. I returned to the steaming hot water. "What is that?" "Willow bark, cloves, and calamus root," he replied, "to help bring down the fever if she is still strong enough to fight." I watched his hands. They moved with concentration, without hesitation. "She was fine 3 days ago," I said, my voice hoarse. Then her fever spiked. I had to tie her wrists so she wouldn't fall out of bed. McCrae said nothing, just soaked the cloth in the mixture and placed it on my mother's forehead. Then he began grinding the dried herbs in the mortar. I sat by the bed and held my mother's limp hand. "I thought she was going to die on the road," I whispered. "I told her to hang on, that there was a man here who could help, that you weren't like the others." McCrae glanced up briefly, his eyes unreadable. "I'm not a miracle." "No," I replied, "but you are the last hope I have left to believe in." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the mortar and pestle, the crackle of the fire, and the heavy breathing of a woman fighting for her life. Then McCrae spoke again. "She'll need to be watched overnight. Stay, do as I say. We'll give her a chance." I nodded, speechless. He dipped a rag in warm herbal water and pressed it gently against my mother's chest. Her feverish breathing slowed a little, but it was enough. The light in the house was dim, shadows falling long across the wooden walls. Outside, dawn had broken, turning the hills golden. But inside, the world was still dim, warm, and thick with the smell of dried herbs and smoke. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Albert McCrae move about the room with quiet precision. He ground herbs in a mortar, poured liquids into small glass vials, and paused every few minutes to check on the woman on the bed. The house tells its own story, with bookshelves filled with earthenware jars, bundles of dried plants, old books in English and Cherokee, and a leather-bound journal filled with careful sketches and handwritten notes. I'm still clutching the edge of my mother's blanket. Watched him work. I had heard the rumors. A Confederate veteran turned hermit whose Cherokee wife died of fever after the war, that he disappeared into the hills and didn't speak to anyone for years. But now those stories feel distant. He's not hiding from the world. He's tending to it more quietly. I stepped forward. "Can I help?" "No," he said without looking at me. "You're tired. Sit down. I want to help." He looked up. "You already did. You brought her here. At least let me." "You are not a maid," he said, pouring flour into a clay bowl. "You do not owe me any work." I blinked, but I offered. "It's all I have left." He looked me straight in the eye for the first time. "I heal because I failed to save the people I love. It's not something you have to pay for, and it doesn't make you indebted to me." I was silent for a moment, then sat down near the bed. My mother's breathing was easier. The fever was still there, but it was no longer raging. "She used to sing every morning," I muttered. "Even if we don't have anything." McCrae stopped beside me. "She's strong. If the fever breaks tonight, she can pull through." I looked around the room. "You learned all this from book?" "Partly," he said. "Mostly from my wife." "Your wife?" "She was Cherokee. Her people taught me to listen to the land, to listen to my body. She showed me how to turn roots into medicine. After she died, I stayed close to her people. They let me learn because I listened. Not many white people do that." I bowed my head. "My father died of fever, too. He treated everyone, black, white, soldiers, outlaws. It didn't matter to him, but it did to others." Albert's jaw clenched. "Where I come from, they hang men for lesser offenses." Silence fell, not empty silence, but full silence. We shared. I busied myself helping with the swabs, giving my mother bitter tea, and arranging the jars while Albert wiped the instruments nearby. For a moment, our hands touched as we reached for a piece of cloth. We both stopped, then pulled our hands back. Then, as he checked on my mother one last time, Albert handed me a folded blanket. "You can sleep here. I'll stay awake. You need to rest too." "What about you?" "I don't sleep much." After a moment, he added, "You'll be able to sleep if you want to be strong enough for her tomorrow." I lay down on the floor next to my mother. The smell of sage and ash enveloped me. I wasn't sure if I would sleep, but when I did, my last thought wasn't of fear. It was of a man with quiet eyes who had traded bullets for leaves and fought just as hard. Dawn poured through the shutters, casting quiet golden streaks across the wooden floor. Inside the small room, the fever had finally broken. I sat by my mother's bed, one hand holding a damp cloth, the other holding her skinny fingers. "Water," my mother whispered, her voice as hoarse as dry leaves. I blinked, holding my breath. "Ma." My mother slowly turned her head, her eyes opening with difficulty. "You look tired." I laughed through the tears that were welling up in my eyes. "You almost died." "Ma, I think I deserve to be tired." I raised the cup to my mother's lips, letting her sip slowly. In the doorway, Albert stood silently, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't smile, but there was a softness around his eyes. "She's stable," he said softly, "but she'll need rest and easy food. Don't get excited." I looked up at him. "Can we stay a few days?" "Just until she can walk again." Albert hesitated, then nodded briefly. "As long as she rests and you don't burn my house down, I'll try to behave." "Yeah, please do." That afternoon, I stepped out into the sunlight for the first time in days. The wind carried the scent of pine and dried sage, and in the distance, rolling hills rolled like waves to the horizon. The scene was quiet, too quiet for one accustomed to the noise of the town, but it enveloped me in a strange, comforting way. Albert was in the garden next door, kneeling beside a row of dead lavender. He looked up as I approached. "She asked me to tell you something," I said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "My mother." Albert brushed the dirt off his hands. "I'm listening." "My daughter lost her father because he helped people. Don't let her lose herself too." Albert's eyes dropped for a moment, then back to me. "She's a wise woman." "She's stubborn," I replied, giving a small smile. "But yeah, wise too." They stood in silence for a moment. I glanced around at the withered plants. "Most of your garden is dead. Winter takes more than it gives," Albert said simply. "And I haven't planted much since last year." I looked at him thoughtfully. "Want me to help?" He raised an eyebrow. "You garden." "My father has a plot of land behind the clinic. I used to weed it when he was too ill to stand. Albert paused. Then he nodded once. The lavender and yarrow roots are ready to be cut. The rest needs to be cleaned up. I walked up to him and squatted down without waiting for further instructions. From that moment on, something changed. Albert handed me the tools without saying anything. I moved naturally between the rows of plants, listening as he explained the difference between canary and daisy, between datura and red root. His voice was deep and patient. It was the first time he had led anyone near the precious medicinal plants he had grown himself. Later that day, after my mother had had a few spoonfuls of broth and fallen asleep, I sat in the kitchen arranging herbs while Albert boiled water. "She's stronger than you think," he said, nodding toward the bedroom. "Like someone I know." I smiled, but there was weariness behind my eyes. She had to be. After Dad died, it was just me and my mother. I was 10 when he collapsed the first time. Albert stirred the kettle slowly. "What happened?" "Fever. He caught it treating a sick soldier, a Union soldier. I think he knew the risks. But he went anyway. People in town said he deserved it." Albert's face tightened. "Some people think doing the right thing means choosing sides. Your father chose people." "Yeah." I looked at him, my voice small. "He did." That evening, as the sun set, Albert invited me to join him on the porch. The air was cool, the sky tinged with pink and copper. My mother slept peacefully inside. "I never thought I'd see you smile again," I said, looking up at the sky. "Not after everything." Albert leaned back in his chair, putting his feet up. "Sometimes all someone needs is a break and a reason." I turned to him. "Do you always talk like this? Like a story you're not sure how to end?" He smirked. "Just for a moment. Maybe, or maybe I just don't believe in easy endings anymore." I said nothing. Neither did he. But as I stood up to go inside, Albert said, "Tomorrow I'll show you how to harvest yarrow roots if you still want to help." I nodded once. I would. And for the first time in months, the word home no longer feels so far away. The fire crackled softly, casting amber streaks of light on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass, but inside the air was still, enveloped in the silence of dusk. I sat at the small table, stringing together bunches of dried mint, my fingers deft though my shoulders ached. Across from me, Albert was polishing a set of tin utensils, the metal glinting in the firelight. My mother had fallen asleep an hour ago. Her breathing was steady now, her face less pale. I hesitated, eyes glancing at Albert's arm as he rolled up his sleeve. A pale scar, long and jagged, cut across his upper arm. It was old, healed, but unmistakable. I said without looking up, "What happened to your arm?" Albert paused. His eyes lingered on the scar for a moment before he continued wiping the blade in his hand. "Arkansas, summer of '65. I looked up, surprised. It was near the end of the fight. He nodded once. "Our unit was escorting a convoy north, mostly medical supply. We were ambushed at a river. I was one of 5 survivors out of 40. My voice was soft. "You were shot, bayonetically, close combat." He set the clean tools aside. "They left us to die." I put my hands in my lap. "And your wife?" He looked toward the fireplace, where the fire was burning. "She died 3 months later. Swamp fever. I tried to cure her myself. But I didn't know enough. Her people blamed the war. I blamed myself." I said nothing. The silence felt sacred, like a wound being opened. "She taught me everything I know about plan," he said softly. "After she died, I stayed with her tribe, learning their ways of life, their healing. I thought if I couldn't save her, maybe I could save someone else." My throat tightened. "That's why I'm doing this." He nodded again, his eyes distant. "It's not about atonement. It's about duty." I thought about it for a moment. Then I said softly, "My father is a doctor." Albert turned to me. He treated everyone, slave, soldier, native families. He didn't care what flag they wore or what color their skin was. He only cared if they were in pain. Albert's brows furrowed. "That must not be easy where you come from." "No," I said. "They call him a traitor, say he's helping the enemy." "What happened to him?" "They dragged him out of the clinic one night. Said he was hiding runaways. They hanged him in the churchyard." I was 12. Albert's expression darkened. "And your mother?" "She stayed, worked as a washerwoman, taught me how to mix cough drops and wash bandages. We stayed open for the sick, even after they stopped coming." He looked at me for a long time, then said softly, "You kept his clinic alive." There was a long silence between us, broken only by the crackling of the firewood. Finally, Albert leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I used to think humans were enemies because they wore different colors, fought for different states. Now I think the real enemies are those who teach us to hate what we don't understand." I looked at him, my eyes meeting his in the firelight. We were never enemies, I said, just survivors on opposite sides of the same storm. And then something amazing happened. Albert smiled. It was a small, fleeting smile, but it reached his eyes, softening the lines of his face as if sunlight had penetrated a long winter. I caught my breath. You should do that more often. He raised an eyebrow. Do what? Smiled. You almost look human. He chuckled, a deep sound that seemed to surprise even himself. Careful, Miss Whitaker. You're starting to sound like you want me to stay. I rested my head on my hands. I'm just saying it's less scary to take medicine from a man who looks less like a storm cloud. He shook his head, still smiling, and rose from his chair. Now, time to check your mother's pulse. I stood up too, and as we moved together through the quiet house, I felt something new stirring beneath the surface, something fragile, unspeakable, but no longer invisible. And though the scars we bear cannot be erased tonight, just for tonight, they no longer feel heavy. The storm came without warning. For a moment, the air was still, thick with the smell of sage and damp earth. The next moment, thunder tore across the sky like a whip, and lightning tore the horizon into zigzag streaks of light. Inside the house, I was awakened by a gasp. I turned toward the bed. My mother was convulsing violently, her limbs thrashing under the covers. Ma, Albert was by the bed. Hold her hand. Don't let her bite her tongue. I quickly crawled to the other side and grabbed my mother's wrist. Her fingers were ice cold, but her skin was burning with fever. A hoarse, choked sound escaped her throat. Half gasp, half cry. She's better, I cried. She's better. Albert bent down, checking her pupil, her breathing. His face tightened. She's having a seizure. The fever's back, really bad. My hands were shaking. What should we do? There's a root, wild kella. It calms the nervous system. I don't have any more. Then we need more. Albert looked out the window. The rain lashed against the glass in thick sheets. The wind whistled through the cracks in the wall. It's on the ridge half a mile north of here. The roads are narrow and slippery in this weather. I don't care. Albert turned to me, his voice low but firm. It's dangerous. Helen, she's dying. I'm going. No. I grabbed my jacket. You can't see in the dark like I can. I know what it looks like. I'll go. He stepped in front of the door. You're not thinking clearly. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice breaking. She's all I have. I've lost a loved one to the fever. I'm not going to lose her just because I'm too scared to climb a damn hill. For a heartbeat, Albert said nothing. Then he grabbed his coat, slung it over his shoulders, and handed me a lantern. Let's go. Stay close. Don't fall behind. We rushed into the night. The cold rain stung our faces as we climbed the narrow trail. Mud clung to our boots. The slope was steep and slippery beneath our feet. My heart pounded in time with the thunder, but I did not stop. Albert went ahead, his lantern casting long shadows. There, he shouted over the wind. On the left, under that cedar, I knelt down, my fingers digging into the damp soil. Dig carefully. The roots are fragile. My hands were bleeding from the rocks and thorns, but I didn't stop until the pale, twisted root was uprooted. I lifted it up, gasping. Got it. Albert took it, examined it, and nodded once. Oh, I am. Let's go. The way down is even worse. Twice I slipped, and both times Albert caught me. The second time, we fell together in the mud. I collapsed against his chest, gasping for breath, his arms around me. We lay there for a moment, the rain pouring down, our breaths mingling. Then he helped me up. We're almost there. Back at the house, I took off my coat and ran to my mother. The seizure had passed, but her breathing was shallow and her lips were blue. Albert crushed the roots, boiled them, strained the mixture into a cup, and raised it to her lip. Come on, he muttered. Come back. I knelt down beside the bed, my face close to my mother. Please, I whispered. Please stay. The seconds seemed like hours. Then my mother stirred, a cough, a gasp. Her chest rose more steadily. I burst into tears, burying my face in the blanket. Albert put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. She's breathing. I turned to him, my eyes filled with tears. You did it. He shook his head. You did it. I suddenly reached for him, wrapping my arms around his neck, my body shaking with relief. You didn't just save her, I whispered into his shoulder. You saved me. Albert hesitated, then put his arms around me. For the first time since the war, he held someone who wasn't dying, wasn't leaving, wasn't a ghost. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, two hearts beat as one, with a life just saved. The morning dawned clear and cloudless, as if the storm had never touched the land. The grass glistened with dew, and birds sang lazily from the oaks behind the mountainside. Inside the house, the warmth lingered on the hearth. In the smell of dried herbs, and in the steady breathing of the woman who had returned from the dead, I folded my mother's last shawl and put it in my saddlebag. The bed was made, the dishes washed, the blankets neatly folded. My mother, now able to walk with a cane, sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the sky. Albert was nowhere to be seen. I moved slowly, not wanting to disturb the peace. My mind was made up. My mother was well enough to travel, and staying any longer felt like asking too much. We were given shelter, medicine, and time. That, I reasoned, was enough. It had to be. I set my bag by the door and headed back to the bedroom to finish packing. That's when I heard the wooden floor creak behind me. I turned around. Albert stood there in his old shirt and dusty boot, hiding something behind his back. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was set like stone. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped forward and held out his hand. A bouquet of wildflowers, lavender, yarrow, yellow daisies, roughly tied, some still with soil on the stems, unarranged, imperfect, but picked with a purpose. I held my breath. "I see you packing," he said softly. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "I thought you wouldn't want us getting in your way anymore." Albert looked down at the flowers in his hand. "You never got my way." A silence fell between us, heavy with all the things left unsaid. I reached for the flowers, my fingers brushing against his. Our hands lingered a moment longer than necessary. Albert cleared his throat. "She has a life waiting for her. A clinic needs to be rebuilt. Maybe," I nodded slowly, "maybe I don't expect you to stay. I didn't think you would ask." He took a breath. Then softly he said, "I've never been good at asking." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not a stoic healer, not a veteran, but the man who had stood beside me in the storm, who had bled with me, climbed mountains for me, stayed up through the darkest nights to keep my mother breathing. "I thought leaving would be simple," I whispered. "It always has been." He stepped closer, his voice now almost inaudible. "You don't need a chain to hold someone who wants to stay." I froze. Those words struck me like a lightning bolt. Not because they were great, but because they were so true. I turned to face him, my eyes sparkling. "Albert," he took my hand, his rough fingers gently closing around mine. "I don't want you to feel tied to me, Helen," he said. "But if you're looking for a place that isn't built on fear or debt, there's room here. Not just to heal, but to live." My lips parted, but the words caught in my throat. I looked down at the wildflowers, imperfect, real, and trembling in my hand. Then I looked up at him. "I came here with a dying woman, a broken name, and no hope." Albert's eyes softened. "But now," I whispered, "I don't feel broken." He didn't move to kiss me, didn't say another word. But in that stillness, in the way his thumb brushed mine, in the breath we shared, everything was understood. I hugged the flowers to my chest, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't plan on staying," I said, "but I'm not sure I can go." Albert said nothing. He didn't need to. The sky above us was vast and blue, and somewhere in the distance, spring was blooming again on the mountainside. The evening fell with a gentle stillness, the kind of stillness that makes even the wind hesitate. The stars began to twinkle across the night sky as I folded the last of the washed sheets by the fireplace. My mother sat nearby, wrapped in her favorite shawl, sipping tea with hands steadier than they had been in weeks. Albert spent most of the day in the shed behind the house. He said little, just a nod as he ate his breakfast, and a look that lasted more than a beat before he walked out with his coat and toolbox. Now, as I helped my mother into bed, the older woman took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Do you love him?" she said, not as a question. I looked down. "Mom." The older woman smiled gently. "Mom may be old, but she's not blind." I sat next to her. "I don't know what this is, what he wants. He is not a man who opens up easily. That man's heart is a locked room." My mother said, her voice low. "But I heard the way he said your name, softly, like a prayer he didn't think he deserved." My throat tightened. "I don't want to make this more difficult than it has to be." My mother took a slow breath, then looked up at the ceiling as if seeing something very far away. "If he doesn't stop you from leaving, fine. But tell him this from me. If he doesn't keep you, then he better not let you go with a broken heart." I looked at her. eyes wide. My mother gave a tired smile. We Whitaker women don't break easily, but when we do, we bleed for a long time. Late that evening, the fire had died down. The house was dark and quiet. I walked into the kitchen, intending to grab my shawl, but what I found instead made me stop. On the table was a small wicker basket. Inside were carefully packed bundles of dried herbs, glass jars, rolls of linen, everything you need to start a healing kit. Next to it was a leather-bound journal. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The first page bore a familiar handwriting. Strong, clear, steady. Helen, leave your footprints in this house. That was it. No signature, no grand gesture. The world had said it all. My knees buckled slightly, and I sat down in the nearest chair, holding my hands to my mouth as tears welled up in my eyes. Not because of sadness, but because a man who had seen so much loss, so much war, so much grief, had left the only invitation he knew how to give. He didn't ask me to stay. He simply created space for me to belong. I gently closed the book, hugging it tightly to my chest, and for the first time in her life, Helen Whitaker felt a love that did not need words to be heard. A simple love is creating space and waiting. 3 months later, the McCrae ranch no longer echoed in silence. Laughter drifted through the windows. The kitchen smelled of fresh mint and slightly charred onions. A kettle hummed, and from the garden, the familiar scurrying of chickens as I chased them away from my herb beds. The house had changed, not in the wall, but in the warmth. Helen now had her own room, built by Albert himself. It was modest, with a window overlooking the garden and a pot of lavender that always bloomed in the morning light. My mother, healthier than anyone could hope to be, claimed the kitchen. She made tea, told stories, and called herself queen of the kitchen, even though she rarely cooked anything but mischief. At dinner, the 3 chairs were always full. Albert sat at the head of the table, quieter than most, but gentler than before. I teased him about the messy labeling on the drying rack. My mother, across from us, would wave her spoon like a judge's gavel and announce new house rules, such as forbidding Albert from lighting another bundle of cigarettes. That evening, after washing the dishes and the sky turning indigo, Albert stepped out onto the porch. I followed, fascinated by something indescribable. He returned, holding a small velvet bag. I tilted my head. Did you forget someone's birthday? He opened the bag, revealing a silver necklace. The pendant was a small, imperfect leaf. I gave this to my wife, he said. She gave it back before she passed away. Told me that maybe someday someone else would need it more. I held my breath. Albert handed it to me. This is not a chain. It's not meant to tie you down, but I want the world to know that this place is now yours, as is my heart. I took it, eyes filled with tears, and stepped forward to kiss him gently. Sure enough, the front door creaked open. My mother poked her head out. It's about time, she muttered, then spoke louder. Are you two gonna stand there all night? This soup needs tasting. They laughed, then followed her inside. The next morning, I saw my mother at the gate hammering something into the ground. It was a wooden sign, hand-carved and uneven. Mom, what is that? With a smile, my mother stepped back. McCrae and Daughters Clinic and Relief. Albert walked out just as the last nail was hammered in. You changed the name of my farm. My mother smirked. You saved 2 women. Let them save you back. He sighed. Defeated. I nudged him. Don't fight back. You've already lost. That night, as the stars began to twinkle, I sat on the porch between my mother and Albert. The wind was cool. The fire was warm, and the silence was no longer empty. We did not say the word home. The walls spoke for us. 3 lives, 3 hearts, 1 life starting over. From inside came my mother's teasing voice. If I knew McCrae could cook like this, I would have been sick years ago. Laughter echoed, and the house, once empty, now filled with every melody. And so, under the vast Texas sky, in a land once marked by silence and grief, 3 souls built a home, not of wall, but of healing, hope, and hands held together to weather the storm. Albert McCrae never said I love you out loud, but in every root he planted, every breath he took, and every space he made for Helen, those words were clear. In an age where love was a risk and tenderness was rare, they chose each other quietly, intensely, and forever.